Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are on section 3, entitled Principles. This is a rather short section, so I will be combining it with section 4, and that one is entitled Method. And then after that, we go straight into Book 2, Poetic Wisdom, which I believe I'll make a separate video. So there's a clear delineation between Book 1 and Book 2 there. So with that said, I'll get started. Principles. Paragraph 330. Now, in order to make trial whether the propositions hitherto enumerated as elements of this science can give form to the materials prepared in the chronological table at the beginning, we beg the reader to consider whatever has been written concerning the principles of any subject in the whole of Gentile knowledge, human and divine. Let him see if it is inconsistent with these propositions, whether with all, or some, or one. For inconsistency with one would amount to inconsistency with all, since each accords with all. Certainly, on making such a comparison, he will perceive that it is a tissue of confused memories, of the fancies of a disordered imagination, that none of it is begotten of intelligence, which has been rendered useless by the two conceits enumerated in the axioms, 125 and 127. For on one hand, the conceit of nations, each believing itself to have been the first in the world, leaves us no hope of getting the principles of our science from the philologians. And on the other hand, the conceit of the scholars, who will have it that what they know must have been eminently understood from the beginning of the world, makes us despair of getting them from the philosophers. So, for purposes of this inquiry, we must reckon if there were no books in the world. 331. But in the night of thick darkness enveloping the earliest antiquity, so remote from ourselves, there shines the eternal and never-failing light of a truth beyond all question, that the world of civil society has certainly been made by men, and that its principles are therefore to be found within the modifications of our own human mind. Whoever reflects on this cannot but marvel that the philosophers should have bent all their energies to the study of the world of nature, which, since God made it, he alone knows, and that they should have neglected the study of the world of nations, or civil world, which, since men had made it, men could hope to know. This aberration was a consequence of that infirmity of the human mind noted in the Axioms, 236, by which immersed and buried in the body, it naturally inclines to take note of bodily things, and finds the effort to attend to itself too laborious, just as the bodily eye sees all objects outside itself, but needs a mirror to see itself. 332. Now, since this world of nations has been made by men, let us see in what things all men agree, and always have agreed. For these things will be able to give us the universal and eternal principles, such as every science must have, on which all nations were founded, and still preserve themselves. 333. We observe that all nations, barbarous as well as civilized, though separately founded because remote from each other in time and space, keep these three human customs. All have some religion, all contract solemn marriages, all bury their dead. And in no nation, however savage and crude, are any human activities celebrated with more elaborate ceremonies and more sacred solemnity than religion, marriage, and burial. For by the axiom, 144, that, quote, uniform ideas, born among peoples unknown to each other, must have a common ground of truth, end quote, it must have been dictated to all nations that from these three institutions humanity began among them all, and therefore they must be devoutly observed by them all, so that the world should not again become a bestial wilderness. For this reason we have taken these three eternal and universal customs as three first principles of this science. 334. Let not our first principle be accused of falsehood by the modern travelers who narrate that peoples of Brazil, South Africa, and other nations of the New World live in society without any knowledge of God, as Antoine Arnauld believes to be the case also of the inhabitants of the islands called Antilles. Persuaded perhaps by them, Bayle affirms in his treatise on comets that peoples can live in justice without the light of God. This is a bolder statement than Polybius ventured in the dictum for which he has been acclaimed, 179, that if the world had philosophers living in justice by reason and not by laws, it would have no need of religions. These are travelers' tales to promote the sale of their books by the narration of portents. Certainly Andreas Rudiger, in his Physics, pretentiously entitled Divine Physica Divina, and purporting to show the only middle path between atheism and superstition, is gravely reproved for this opinion by the censors of the University of Geneva. They charge that he states it with too much assurance, which is the same as saying that with not a little boldness. Yet in the Republic of Geneva, as being free and popular, there would be considerable freedom in writing. For all nations believe in a provident divinity, yet through all the length of years and all the breadth of this civil world, it has been possible to find only 4 primary religions. The first is that of the Hebrews, whence came that of the Christians, both believing in the divinity of an infinite free mind. The third is that of the Gentiles, who believe in the divinity of a plurality of gods, each imagined as composed of body and of free mind. Hence, when they wish to signify the divinity that rules and preserves the world, they speak of Deus Immortalis. The fourth and last is that of the Mohammedans, who believe in the divinity of one God, an infinite free mind and an infinite body, for they look forward to pleasures of the senses as rewards in the other life. 335. No nation has believed in a God all body or in a God all mind, but not free. And so neither the Epicureans, who attribute to God body alone, and chance together with body, nor the Stoics, who in this respect the Spinozists of their day, make God an infinite mind, subject to fate in an infinite body, could reason of commonwealths or laws. And Benedict Spinoza speaks of the commonwealth as of a society of shopkeepers. Cicero was indeed right when he told the Epicurean Atticus that he could not discuss laws with him unless he first granted the existence of divine providence. Such is the compatibility of these two sects, the Stoic and the Epicurean, with Roman jurisprudence, which takes divine providence for its first principle. 336. In the second place, the opinion that the sexual unions which certainly take place between free men and free women without solemn matrimony are free of natural wickedness, i.e., do not offend the law of nature, all the nations of the world have branded as false by the human customs with which they all religiously celebrate marriages, thereby determining that this sin is bestial, though in venial degree. And for this reason, such parents, since they are held together by no necessary bond of law, are bound to abandon their natural children. Since their parents may separate at any time, if they are abandoned by both, the children must lie exposed to be devoured by dogs. If humanity, public or private, does not bring them up, they will have to grow up with no one to teach them religion, language, or any other human custom. So that as for them, they are bound to cause this world of nations, enriched and adorned by so many beautiful arts of humanity, to revert to the great ancient forest through which in their nefarious feral wanderings once roamed the foul beasts of Orpheus, among whom bestial venery was practiced by sons with mothers, and by fathers with daughters. This is the infamous nephis of the outlaw world, which Socrates, by rather inappropriate physical reasons, tried to prove was forbidden by nature, whereas it is human nature that forbids it. For such relationships are abhorred naturally by all nations, nor were they ever practiced by any save in their last stage of corruption, as among the Persians. 337. Finally, to realize what a great principle of humanity burial is, Imagine a feral state in which human bodies remain unburied on the surface of the earth as food for the crows and dogs. Certainly, this bestial custom will be accompanied by uncultivated fields and uninhabited cities. Men will go about like swine, eating the acorns found amidst the putrefaction of their dead. And so, with good reason, burials were characterized by the sublime phrase, compacts of the human race, and with less grandeur were described by Tacitus as fellowships of humanity. Furthermore, it is an opinion in which all Gentile nations have certainly concurred that the souls of the unburied remain restless on the earth and go wandering about their bodies, and consequently that they do not die with their bodies, but are immortal. That such was the consensus of the ancient barbarous nations may be inferred from what we are told of the present peoples of Guinea by Hugo van Linschoten, of those of Peru and Mexico by Acosta, of the inhabitants of Virginia by Thomas Harriot, of those of New England by Richard Whitbourne, of those of the kingdom of Siam by Just Schouten. Thus Seneca concludes, "When we discuss immortality, we are influenced in no small degree by the general opinion of mankind, who either fear or worship the spirits of the lower world. I make the most of this general belief." This is the end of Section 3 on Principles. We now proceed to Section 4 entitled Method. Paragraph 338. To complete the establishment of the principles which have been adopted for this science, it remains in the first book to discuss the method which it should follow. It must begin where its subject matter began, as we said in the axioms. We must therefore go back with the philologians and fetch it from the stones of Ducleon and Pyrrha, from the rocks of Amphion, from the men who sprang up from the furrows of Cadmus, or the hard oak of Virgil. With the philosophers we must fetch it from the frogs of Epicurus, from the cicadas of Hobbes, from the simpletons of Grotius, from the men cast into this world without care or aid of God, of whom Pufendorf speaks, as clumsy and wild, as the so-called Patagonian giants, who are said to be found near the Strait of Magellan, which is as much as to say from the Cyclopes of Homer, in whom Plato recognizes the first fathers and the state of the families. This is the science of the philologians and philosophers have given us the beginnings of humanity. Our treatment of it must take its start from the time these creatures began to think humanly. In their monstrous savagery and unbridled bestial freedom, there was no means to tame the former or bridle the latter by the frightful thought of some divinity, the fear of whom, as we said in the axioms, is the only powerful means of reducing to duty a liberty gone wild. To discover the way in which this first human thinking arose in the Gentile world, we encountered exasperating difficulties, which have cost us the research of a good 20 years. We had to descend from these human and refined natures of ours to those quite wild and savage natures, which cannot at all imagine and can apprehend only with great effort. 339. By reason of all this, we must start from the notion of God, such as even the most savage, wild, and monstrous men do not lack. That notion we show to be this: that man, fallen into despair of all the succors of nature, desires something superior to save him. That something superior to nature is God, and this is the light that God has shed on all men. Confirmation may be found in a common human custom, that libertines grown old, feeling their natural forces fail, turn naturally to religion. 340. But these first men, who later became the princes of the Gentile nations, must have done their thinking under the strong impulsion of violent passions, as beasts do. We must therefore proceed from a vulgar metaphysics, such as we have mentioned in the axioms, and such as we shall find in the theology of the poets to have been, and seek by its aid that frightful thought of some divinity which imposed form and measure on all bestial passions of these lost men, and thus transformed them into human passions. From this thought must have sprung the impulse proper to the human will, to hold in check the motions impressed on the mind by the body, so as either to quiet them altogether, as becomes the sage, or at least to direct them to better use, as becomes the civil man. This control over the motion of their bodies is certainly an effect of the freedom of the human will, and thus of free will, which is the home and seat of all the virtues, and among the others of justice. When informed by justice, the will is the fount of all that is just, and of all the laws dictated by justice. But to endow bodies with impulse amounts to giving them freedom to regulate their motions, whereas all bodies are by nature necessary agents. And what the theorists of mechanics call powers, forces, impulses, are insensible motions of bodies, by which they approach their centers of gravity, as ancient mechanics had it, or depart from their centers of motion as modern mechanics has it. 341. But men, because of their corrupted nature, are under the tyranny of self-love, which compels them to make private utility their chief guide. Seeking everything useful for themselves and nothing for their companions, they cannot bring their passions under control to direct them toward justice. We thereby establish the fact that man in the bestial state desires only his own welfare. Having taken wife and begotten children, he desires his own welfare along with that of his family. Having entered upon civil life, he desires his own welfare along with that of his city. When its rule is extended over several peoples, he desires his own welfare along with that of the nation. When the nations are united by wars, treaties of peace, alliances, and commerce, he desires his own welfare along with that of the entire human race. In all these conditions, man desires principally his own utility. Therefore, it is only by divine providence that he can be held within these orders to practice justice as a member of the society of the family, the state, and finally of mankind. Unable to attain all the utilities he wishes, he is constrained by these orders to seek those which are his due, and this is called just. That which regulates all human justice is therefore divine justice, which is administered by divine providence to preserve human society. 342. In one of its principal aspects, this science must therefore be a rational civil theology of divine providence, which seems hitherto to have been lacking. For the philosophers have either been altogether ignorant of it, as the Stoics and the Epicureans were, the latter asserting that human affairs are agitated by a blind concourse of atoms, the former that they are drawn by a deaf, inexorable chain of cause and effect. Or they have considered it solely in the order of natural things, giving the name of natural theology to the metaphysics in which they contemplate this attribute, i.e., the providence of God, and in which they confirm it by the physical order observed in the motions of such bodies as the spheres, and the elements and the final cause observed in other and minor natural things. But they ought to have studied it in the economy of civil things, in keeping with the full meaning of applying to providence the term divinity from divinari, to divine, that is, to understand what is hidden from men, the future, or what is hidden in them, their consciousness. It is this that makes up the first and principal part of the subject matter of jurisprudence, namely, the divine things on which depend the human things, which make up its other and complementary part. Our new science must therefore be a demonstration, so to speak, of the historical fact of providence, for it must be a history of the forms of order, which, without human discernment or intent, and often against the designs of men, Providence has given to this great city of the human race. For though this world has been created in time and particular, the orders established therein by Providence are universal and eternal. 343. In contemplation of this infinite and eternal Providence, our science finds certain divine proofs by which it is confirmed and demonstrated. Since divine Providence has omnipotence as minister, it develops its orders by means as easy as the natural customs of men. Since it has infinite wisdom as counselor, whatever it establishes is order. Since it has for its end its own immeasurable goodness, Whatever it ordains must be directed to a good always superior to that which men have proposed to themselves. 344. In the deplorable obscurity of the beginnings of the nations and in the innumerable variety of their customs, for a divine argument which embraces all human things, no sublimer proofs can be desired than those provided by the aforesaid naturalness, order, and end, the preservation of the human race. These proofs will become luminous and distinct when we reflect with what ease things are brought into being, by occasions arising far apart and sometimes quite contrary to the proposals of men, yet fitting together of themselves. Such proofs omnipotence affords. Compare the things with one another, and observe the order by which those are now born in their proper times and places which ought now to be born, and others deferred for births in theirs. And all the beauty of order, according to Horace, consists in this. Such proofs eternal wisdom provides. Consider, finally, if in these occasions, places, and times we can conceive how other divine benefits could arise, by which, in view of the particular needs and ills of men, human society could be better conducted or preserved. Such proofs the eternal goodness of God will give. 345. Thus, the proper and consecutive proof here adduced will consist in comparing and reflecting whether our human mind, and the series of possibilities it is permitted to understand, and as far as it is permitted to do so, can conceive more or fewer or different causes than those from which issue from the effects of the civil world. In doing this, the reader will experience in his mortal body a divine pleasure as he contemplates in the divine ideas this world of nations in all the extent of its places, times, and varieties. And he will find that he has in effect convinced the Epicureans that their chance cannot wander foolishly about and everywhere find a way out, and the Stoics that their eternal chain of causes, to which they will have it if the world is chained, itself hangs upon the omnipotent, wise, and beneficent will of the best and greatest God. 346. These sublime proofs of natural theology will be confirmed for us by the following sorts of logical proofs. In reasoning of the origins of things, divine and human in the Gentile world, we reach those first beginnings, beyond which it is vain curiosity to demand others earlier. And this is the defining character of first principles. We explain the particular ways in which they come into being, just as they did in those particular times, places, and fashions, which is to say with those particular natures, as we have set forth in 2 axioms. 347. In search of these natures of human things, our science proceeds by a severe analysis of human thoughts about human necessities or utilities of social life, which are the 2 perennial springs of the natural law of nations, as we have remarked in the axioms. In its second principal aspect, our science is therefore a history of human ideas, on which it seems the metaphysics of the human mind must proceed. This queen of the sciences, by the axiom that, quote, the sciences must begin where their subject matters began, took its start when the first men began to think humanly, and not when the philosophers began to reflect on human ideas, as in the erudite and scholarly little book recently published by Brucker, under the title The Philosophical History of the Doctrine of Ideas, which comes down to the latest controversies between the 2 foremost minds of our age, Leibniz and Newton. 348. To determine the times and places for such a history, that is, when and where these human thoughts were born, and thus to give it certainty by means of its own, so to speak, metaphysical chronology and geography, our science applies a likewise metaphysical art of criticism with regard to the founders of these same nations, in which it took more than 1,000 years for those writers to come forward with whom philological criticism has hitherto been occupied. And the criterion our criticism employs, in accordance with an axiom above stated, is that taught by the divine providence and common to all nations, namely, the common sense of the human race, determined by the necessary harmony of human things, in which all the beauty of the civil world consists. The decisive sort of proof in our science is therefore this, that, once these orders were established by divine providence, the course of affairs of nations had to be, must now be, and will have to be such as our science demonstrates, even if infinite worlds were produced from time to time throughout eternity, which is certainly not the case. 349. Our science therefore comes to describe at the same time an ideal eternal history, traversed in time by the history of every nation in its rise, progress, maturity, decline, and fall. Indeed, we go so far as to assert that whoever meditates this science tells himself this ideal eternal history only so far as he makes it by that proof, quote, "It had, has, and will have to be," end quote. For the first indubitable principle above posited is that this world of nations has certainly been made by men, and its guise must therefore be found within the modifications of our own human mind. And history cannot be more certain than when he who creates the things also describes them. Thus our science proceeds exactly as does geometry, which, while it constructs out of its elements or contemplates the world of quantity, itself creates it, but with a reality greater in proportion to that of the orders having to do with human affairs, in which there are neither points, lines, surfaces, nor figures. And this very fact is an argument, O reader, that these proofs are of a kind divine, and should give thee a divine pleasure, since in God knowledge and creation are one and the same thing. 350. By the definitions of truth and certitude above proposed, men were for a long period incapable of truth and of reason, which is the fount of that inner justice by which the intellect is satisfied. This justice was practiced by the Hebrews, who, illuminated by the true God, were by his divine law forbidden even to have unjust thoughts, about which no mortal lawgiver ever troubled himself. For the Hebrews believed in a God all-mind, who searches the hearts of men, and the Gentiles believed in gods composed of bodies and mind who could not do so. This same inner justice was later reasoned out by philosophers, who did not arise until 2,000 years after the nations were founded. In the meantime, the nations were governed by the certitude of authority, that is, by the same criterion which is used by our metaphysical criticism, namely the common sense of the human race, which we have defined above in the elements, and on which the conscience of all nations reposes. So that in this third principal regard, our science comes to be a philosophy of authority, which is the fount of the outer justice of which the moral theologians speak. Of such authority, account should have been taken by the three princes of the doctrine of the natural law of nations, and not of that drawn by passages in the writers. For the authority of which we speak reigned from the nations for more than 1,000 years before writers could arise, and they could have taken no cognizance of it. For that reason, Grotius, more learned and erudite than either of the others, combats the Roman jurisconsults in almost every particular detail of this doctrine. But all his blows fall short, for the jurisconsults establish their principles of justice on the certitude of the authority of the human race, not on the authority of the learned. 351. These are the philosophic proofs our science will use, and consequently those which are absolutely necessary for pursuing it. The philological proofs must come last. They all reduce to the following kinds. 352. First, that our mythologies agree with the results of our meditations, not by force and distortion, but directly, easily, and naturally. That they will be seen to be civil histories of the first peoples, who are everywhere found to have been naturally poets. 353. Second, that the heroic phrases, as here explained in the full truth of the sentiments and full propriety of the expressions, also agree. 354. Third, that the etymologies of the native languages also agree, which tells us the histories of the things signified by the words, beginning with their original and proper meanings, and pursuing the natural progress of their metaphors according to the order of the ideas, on which the history of languages must proceed, as we have premised in the axioms. 355. Fourth, the mental vocabulary of human social things, which are the same in substance as felt by all nations, but diversely expressed in language according to their diverse manifestations, is exhibited to be such as we conceived it in the axioms. 356. Fifth, truth is sifted from falsehood in everything that has been preserved for us through long centuries by those vulgar traditions, which, since they have been preserved for so long a time by entire peoples, must, by an axiom above stated, have had a public ground of truth. 357. Sixth, the great fragments of antiquity, hitherto useless to science because they lay neglected, broken and scattered, shed great light when cleaned, pieced together, and set in place. 358. Seventh and last, to all these things, as to their necessary causes, are assigned all the effects narrated by certain history. 359. These philological proofs enable us to see in fact the things we have meditated in idea concerning this world of nations, in accordance with Bacon's method of philosophizing, which is, quote, think and see, end quote. Thus it is that with the help of the preceding philosophical proofs, the philological proofs which follow both confirm their own authority by reason and at the same time confirm reason by their authority. 360. From all that has been set forth in general concerning the establishment of the principles of this science, we conclude that, since its principles are divine providence, moderation of the passions by marriage, and immortality of human souls, witnessed by burial, and since the criterion it uses is that what is felt to be just by all men, or by the majority, must be the rule of social life, and on these principles and this criterion there is agreement between the vulgar wisdom of all lawgivers and the esoteric wisdom of the philosophers of greatest repute. These must be the bounds of human reason, and let him who would transgress them beware lest he transgress all humanity. This is the end of Section 4 on Method. In the next video, we will proceed to Book 2, entitled Poetic Wisdom. Thank you for listening.